Welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Patsy Horton and I am the Arts and Cultural Programmer here. I think some people have been to events here before. I always start like this. My name is Patsy. I'm the Arts and Cultural Programmer here. So it's great to see so many of you here. You're very welcome, and want to extend a very warm welcome to Glen Patterson, who is the Director of the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's, to Stephen Sexton, Don Watson, and in a further addition to the advertised lineup, Dane Holt, and you'll be hearing more from them very shortly. I have to say a little bit about housekeeping. Turn off your phones, please, just remember that, and put them on silent. No fire drill planned for today, so if you hear the alarm, follow myself or a member of staff from the building and we will lead you to safety. I've also left an evaluation form on your seat, and I'd be very grateful if you could take a couple of minutes at the end to fill that out. That feedback is very valuable to us in terms of future programming. And I just also want to give a shout out to the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and the National Lottery Fund, who helped to support the programme of events here at the Linen Hall. And copies of our programme of events, or What's On Guide, which runs up until the end of September, are available just as you come in the door. So do feel free to pick one up on your way out. We're holding this event tonight in partnership with the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's, and delighted to have such an appropriate association for tonight and to mark a decade since Seamus Heaney's death. Quite rightly, there has been a lot of coverage and numerous events to mark the anniversary. Tonight, we are marking it by focusing on Heaney's poetry, celebrating its bright light as well as the door into the dark that it offers us, and also by focusing on the legacy of Heaney's poetry for new generations of poets. What does Heaney's poetry mean to them, and how has it impacted on their work or on their approach to the work? I know this is going to be a terrific event because we've got a fantastic lineup of poets, and I'm delighted to hand over to Glen Patterson from the Seamus Heaney Centre to introduce the event tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Patsy, and thanks everybody else for coming out tonight. I think probably all of us have been asking ourselves today, can it really be 10 years? It seems extraordinary that it is that long, and yet at the same time it still feels very recent, and I think still many of us, it still feels like quite a shock sometimes when we still think that Seamus Heaney isn't with us. In a slightly different way for me as the director of the Seamus Heaney Centre, it's extraordinary to think that we have been 20 years since we opened, 2003, and when we had the official opening in 2004, Seamus was there, and said at that first of all, how fortunate we were that he allowed us to have his name for our centre, how generous that is to give your name and allow it to be used in that way. And at the opening, the official opening, he said that the centre was an act of faith in the imaginative and intellectual life that had brought such repute to the university. And every day I think that when we are in that centre, I think we want to repay that act of faith. Very soon we're about to move to a new building, not very far from where we are now, just further down University Road. And that feels like, well, to invoke tonight's title, a further stepping stone for the Seamus Heaney Centre. I think it's really appropriate that when Patsy and I and Rachel Brown from the Centre were talking about tonight's event and what we might do, that we thought about stepping stones, this wonderful book of interviews, conversation between Seamus and Dennis O'Driscoll, again another great poet, no longer with us, Wonderful interviews, and we thought that for tonight we wanted to look forward, and so we were thinking that what better way to do that than to invite some of the finest poets, all of whom are associated with the Seamus Heaney Centre, and are just some of the finest poets currently writing, to talk about Heaney's influence on their reading and on their writing. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening. They're all doctors, by the way. Their titles just got left off. They're doctor. Just you see their names: Dr. Stephen Sexton, who we're calling this further stepping stones, and I'm going to be introducing them because Stephen's been at the Seamus Heaney Centre as a lecturer rather longer than Don Watson, who's also a lecturer at the Seamus Heaney Centre, and Dane Holt is our current publishing fellow at the Seamus Heaney Centre. But in some ways they all overlap. But if I introduce them in the order in which, reverse order actually, because Don's going to be the first one who's going to read. But I'm going to introduce Stephen first. Stephen's going to lead a conversation after the three of them have read. And so Stephen is the, you know this, I'm sure, he is the, has published 2 volumes of poetry so far. For If All the World and Love Were Young, for which he received the Forward Prize, and Cheryl's Destinies. Actually, I think he's just got a permanent room in Forward because he was nominated for the Forward Prize with Cheryl's Destinies and then was a judge on the Forward Prize last year. And Don Watson, as I say, is, I just realised my words going up and down on the screen there. That's a kind of a really, really strange thing. I did a thing once where I kicked over a glass of water beside the podium and swore, and somebody took a photograph. Somebody took a photograph at that moment, and so all my mum could see was me standing and my swear words on the screen. I'm not going to do that tonight because the water is over there. Don Watson, who has recently joined the staff of the Seamus Heaney Centre and completed a PhD with us, and whose wonderful, wonderful book, We Play Here, was published on the 3rd of August, I'm going to say? 3rd of August, with a great event in the Great Hall at Queen's. Everything in the Great Hall is great. That really was a terrific event. And Dane Holt completes our lineup. Dane Holt, who wins the prize for the greatest title ever, which is Many Professional Wrestlers Never Retire, his lifeboat pamphlet, and is, as I say, our current publishing fellow at the Seamus Heaney Centre, and the winner of the Brotherton Prize poetry in 2019. So those are our 3 poets who are going to read, and then we're going to have a conversation, and we might have a little bit of time if I shut up and sit down for you to ask a few questions. So would you please welcome the 3 of them to the stage, and the first one to the microphone is going to be Don Watson.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. I was going to talk a little bit about Heaney's influence on me through a specific collection of his, which is called the Spirit Well. And then I'll read a poem from the book, followed by an extract of one of my own poems from my recent collection We Play Here. I found myself drawn to Seamus Heaney most specifically during my Masters in Poetry at Queen's University. There was a strike the week we were due to study the Spirit Level, so instead I took myself on a walk up the Cave Hill with a peanut butter sandwich, packed lunch and a copy of the book. I read it sitting up at McCart's Fort, overlooking a sort of cold Belfast, as I remember. Published 2 years after the IRA ceasefire in 1994, the book's sunny yellow cover opens to a complex collection of cautious optimism. Immediately, the rainstick toy of the opening poem, upending and upending, and the promise of a music you would never have known to listen for. Just as the spirit level of the book's title measures if a surface is straight from left to right or up and down, Heaney's precise formal tercets in the rainstick present the collection's concern with finding an equilibrium between the earth's lyric form and the airy wonder of imagination. Heaney's a poet with a feel for the elemental in the everyday. The spirit level also seeks out the balance point inside our own selves between childhood and adulthood. The idea of the deep living past experienced again now in the present moment. The weird landscape of childhood and how it extends from there to here was the seed of thought behind my recent poetry collection, We Play Here. It's a book of 4 poem sequences that tell the stories of 4 12-year-old girls growing up in North Belfast in the 1980s. The kids have turbulent home lives and they seek balance and escape in their imaginative engagement with their environment. At one point in all 4 sequences, the girls arrive at a contemplation of the Belfast harbour cranes, Samson and Goliath, the farthest extent of their known world, viewed from the flat, wide horizon of the Grove Park, their own spirit level of sorts. In his depictions of childhood, Heaney transcends physical and precise detail, which he pays close attention to, and generates a sense of hope that strains upwards from its formal tethers. In A Sofa in the 40s, Heaney balances rhythmic formal structure with whoop and holler as he and his siblings kneel on the settee and pretend to be a ghost train or a death gondola with elbows going like pistons. Heaney's always meticulous attention to form stands in tension with the remembered rambunctious chaos of the children, and it's this tension that generates such authenticity and life. Similarly with The Swing, the kids learning one by one to go sky high, giving way to the possibility of themselves as adults, sailing beyond ourselves and over and above the rafters. A sense of introversion and earthbound work rewarded with such joyful release. Shortly before We Play Here was published, my editor pointed out that a word I use in the text much more frequently than others was gap. Unconsciously or not, for me, gap speaks to more than the absence of things. Rather, gap refers to the outline of what was there and what will always be there, in a way, between here and there and then and now. The spirit level, too, is full of gaps and liminal spaces. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass in postscript. The speaker in a call who found himself listening to the amplified grave ticking of hall clocks where the phone lay unattended as he waited for his dad to come to the phone. But one poem in the collection I often go back to in my mind, and that perhaps best embodies the things I've spoken about here, is The Gravel Walks. It's a mysterious, elemental poem, rich with sensory rhythm, sound, and rhyme, that chimes with Elizabeth Bishop's assertion that our knowledge is historical, flowing, and flow. Heaney's poem rings a powerful note of hope, daring, and defiance, that we can alter the emotional weight of the past through the telling, through poetry, fundamentally, and the paradox of establishing yourself somewhere in between those solid batches. This is The Gravel Walks. River gravel in the beginning, that high summer, and the angler's motorbike deep in roadside flowers, like a fallen knight whose ghost we'd lately questioned. Any luck? As the engines of the world prepared, green nuts dangled and clustered closer to the whirlpool. The trees dipped down, the flints and sandstone bits worked themselves smooth and smaller in a sparkle of shallow, hurrying barley sugar water, where minnows schooled that we scared when we played. An eternity that ended once a tractor dropped its link box in the gravel bed, and cement mixers began to come to life, and men in dungarees, like captive shades, mixed concrete, loaded, wheeled, turned, wheeled, as if the Pharaoh's brickyards burned inside their heads. Poured and praised the verity of gravel. gems for the undiluted, milt of earth, its plain, champing song against the shovel, sound tests and sandblasts words like honest worth, beautiful in or out of the river. The kingdom of gravel was inside you too. Deep down, far back, clear water running over pebbles of caramel, hailstone, and mackerel blue. But the actual washed stuff kept you slow and steady as you went stooping with your barrow full into an absolution of the body, the shriven life, tired bones, and marrow feel. So walk on air against your better judgment, establishing yourself somewhere in between those solid batches mixed with grey cement and a tune called the Gravel Walks that conjures green. Just want to finish with a short extract from this. This is We Play Here. This is the book of 4 poem sequences. So the bit I'm going to read is a 12-year-old girl called Nell. She's the speaker. Her dad has died of cancer, and the grief of that, she's surviving by imagining Belfast has turned into a river. Everything is submerged in water. They buried him on a Saturday. The big wake was at my aunt's house on Skegney Avenue. I saw his white face through a crack in the living room door. The coffin floated to the hearse. The crowd in Brentwood Football Club cheered. Its blue metal turnstile creaked and whoopeted. The marsh ground under the pallbearers' feet was thick with flip-flop pike. When the great move was finally over and done, Ashfield Gardens closed its doors one by one. From across the street came the clink and batter of hammers and chisels. Metal sounds different when it sings on water. Midges gathered in clouds. My mum and brothers locked themselves inside a room with purple chintz dragonfly wallpaper. They were crying and my mum was crying. She wailed, "But isn't it like this anyway, sure? Isn't it always the same?" I grabbed my BMX. It's not easy to ride in a river, lake, or sea. I headed to Grove Park, wobbling on mud banks, slanted beneath hedges and bolted garden gates. Green Saracen turrets peeped out of the water. On the corner, the man with the long black rifle and combat boots, lonely looks, white ceramic dogs. When my bike's blue tires spun in silt, I planted my left foot among discarded cans, stones, and metal bed frames. I climbed off to push in patches. I crossed Skegney Drive on pallets stretched between boulders. I crossed Jellicoe Avenue on fallen silver birch. The park's green railings stretched for miles. Its wrought iron points wriggled above the water. I got off my bike and squeezed it through a gap. The grass river stretched wide to the horizon, to the crest of a hill where the water thinned. Rusted metal benches were sunk at angles. Sycamores stood at the edge like stuck pins. It was all sky and cold and river. I pushed my bike to the top and stared out at the docks. Fat cargo crates in pine green and ultramarine were locked in a stare down with the gantries. I rang my bell to set its thin clink echoing over the dark water to the neck of the dry dock. The tiny sticklebacks gathered at my feet. When the river goes down, I whispered, I will go and get my skateboard back. I will punch those 2 boys in the face. I won't be afraid. I'm as good as anyone. I pedalled hard down the very steep hill, and the river welled behind me, a flood of silver motes. I would wait on that bright yellow crane for the waters to subside. I would wait above the rivets and slipways where everything smells like honeysuckle. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello. much, Dawn. It was really beautiful reading. The beautiful reading of Heaney. I thought the poem I'm going to read is from this beautiful collection, Fieldwork. I was very late to Seamus Heaney because I'm late to everything, but I came to Belfast in 2015, and so I'd been at university since 2011 till 2014 and was taking a creative writing class, writing poetry without ever having read any poetry. So the poems that I write were very bad. But I'd read a few Heaney poems in anthologies, and I knew of him as a lodestar in the sky of poetry. And then when I came to Belfast, I thought better read some Seamus Heaney poems. So then I read all of Seamus Heaney that was available, and every poem that I read was a new event in language. But when I read the collection Fieldwork, there was an even greater newness. And I knew that all these poems were going to stay with me forever and were going to mean more to me every time I read them. When I read around the book, I realised that the 70s was sort of a big decade for Heaney. Went to Berkeley in 97. So back and forth in the 70s, and every time he sort of went to Berkeley for a semester or a year, he seems to come back and have a new way of expressing this thing that we do, and always in more surprising ways. And Fieldwork, I think, is the exemplar of that sort of period, because he comes back with a real sense of guilt, mainly guilt that we all feel about not being better poets, because we could all be better, but there's stuff that gets in the way, like having a family and having to work, and then the guilt that comes from thinking that your family is the thing that gets in the way of writing poems, which this poem is about. I think I like this poem the most because it's so unlike Heaney, but then so like Heaney. It's so self-accusatory and quite funny as well in its self-accusatory, but deeply serious about what the changing role of the poet is. And I guess it's in the voice of the poet's wife, and what the poet's wife makes of the poet. It's called And Afterwards. She would plunge all poets in the ninth circle and fix them, tooth in skull, tonguing for brain. For backbiting in life, she'd make their hell a rabid, egotistical daisy chain. Unyielding, spurred, ambitious, unblunted, lockjawed, man-trapped, each a fastened badger jockeying for position, hasped and mounted like Ugolino on Archbishop Roger. And when she'd make her circuit of the ice, aided and abetted by Virgil's wife, I would cry out, "My sweet, who wears the bays in our green land above? Who is the life most dedicated and exemplary?" And she, "I have closed my widowed ears to the sulphurous news of poets and poetry. Why could you not have oftener in our years unclenched and come down laughing from your room and walk the twilight with me and your children? Like that one evening of elder bloom and hay, when the wild roses were fading. And after some macker gaffs me in the neck, you weren't the worst. You aspired to a kind, indifferent, faults on both sides tact. You left us first, and then those books behind." So that poem has sort of lived with me for a long time, of what everyone else must think about this thing that we do. And with that in mind, that idea of sort of moving or trying to move back and forth between two worlds was what was in mind in this poem. This is called Poem from the New Life. Birds look at me differently in this new life, like angels with discreet messages from God knows where. Like God, the vocabulary of this new life shrinks until nothing need be said. In this new life, I'm among others, aboard a boat, and the sun takes its sweet time going down, so everyone can get a great photo of themselves in stark, umbrous contrast, their elbows resting on the bow rail. It's the kind of new life you only get one of if you're lucky, two if you're not. One day soon perhaps, someone from the old life will find themselves here, unsteady on their feet at first, and will look at each other and ask, "What are you doing here?" And neither will have an answer prepared.
Am I audible enough? A little bit closer? Is this a little better? A little better. Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here. It's lovely to be here with you. I'm going to read two poems. I would like to tell you a little bit about the first one. We're going to, in a few moments, have a little bit of a conversation, and afterwards we hope that you might be able to share some thoughts or comments or questions if you would like to, because I know that for all of us, Heaney and his work will have meant a lot to you, and we hope there's a chance that you will be able to share some thoughts, reflections, something like that. I'm going to start as the pattern by now. I'm going to read a poem of Heaney's. The poem of his that I'm going to read is called St. Kevin and the Blackbird. It comes from the sort of middle 1990s of his career. So in a different kind of contemplative mood. I mean, I guess as Dane said, the 1970s and a little bit of the 1980s was a period of responding to conflict and really questioning what the artist is for. What do you do in this time? How might you do it? This period a little bit later, I think, is a different, slightly more philosophical mood, although that's always a path through his work. But I know that some of you might not know this poem so well, St. Kevin and the Blackbird, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the context of it first of all. I don't know very much about St. Kevin, or at least I didn't know very much about St. Kevin. But where this poem happens, it happens in two parts. It happens with a kind of mythological scene, and then it has a kind of reflection afterwards. In this particular poem, St. Kevin is praying. He's a saint, as you might imagine. And there's a word in here. He's in his cell, and I just want to clarify that cell is the cell that a monk might have. But in this poem, the scene, if I can give it to you, is that he is in a cell that is so narrow that in order to pray, as I imagine a saint does, is like this, with both arms out. This cell is so narrow that he has to stand with one arm out the window, if you can visualize that. And in this poem, a blackbird lands in the palm of his hand. And as a saint, he now has to consider what to do, to let it nest there or not to. It's kind of the scene of this. Then the poem thinks that through a little further. But the reason why I bring this is because every year when I have started a sort of class with my students, I've always had them read this poem. It's a marvellous, marvellous poem. I think it's also an incredibly instructive poem, both in terms of how one might conduct oneself as an artist, how one might conduct oneself as a person. Is this small act of kindness, despite the discomfort, the right thing to do? Is one of the very central questions here. But let me read the poem, and I'll tell you what I especially like about it afterwards. So two short parts. St. Kevin and the Blackbird. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but the cell is narrow. So one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked, neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful or in agony all the time, from the neck on out down through his hurting forearms? Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labour and not to seek reward, he prays, a prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. The text came through okay. A marvelous, marvelous poem. There's so many things that I admire about it so much. You might notice that both parts of it start with, and then there wasn't Kevin in the Blackbird, versus, and since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, which I think is a strangely humorous way of doing this. But what I love about this poem so much is it seems to suggest two ways of thinking about story, of how we think of any story or any narrative. One is the myth, as we know it, that you might come across flicking through the big book of saints. You would, and then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird, that kind of responds to the story or tells it. But the second part is the really complicated human bit, which is to say, but wait a minute, let's actually think about this. Imagine how much that would have hurt. Imagine how much that would have taken for a real person to do that. Imagine being Kevin. Imagine what that was like. And I think that deeply ethical impulse to think about stories and not simply to take them for granted is a really important lesson for all of us, especially the matters of our own histories. And this question of, which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? Which is better, to forget about it or to remember it in agony? It seems like a really difficult ethical question. It seems a good thing for young students starting out in a life of verse to really consider. Self-forgetful or in agony all the time. Seems like the way. But the line I like most in it, as you might have heard, is that line, to labour and not to seek reward. That's the sort of key line in this poem that I think is especially instructive for anyone who wants to make art in some way. As I joke with my students, and I guess I'll joke with you, easier to write that line when you just won the Nobel Prize. It's a little easier to labour and not to seek reward. But we can only assume it's written before. But I think nevertheless, an incredibly instructive poem, one that I think about all the time in all kinds of ways. I'd like to read a poem of mine that is related in a loose kind of way. I guess it's vaguely religious. I'm not a religious person, but I've been thinking about that a lot. And I think one of the questions of that Heaney poem is a kind of ideological problem of does the ends justify the means? Do the ends justify the means? Is suffering for this kind of spiritual redemption worth it? Is suffering at all ever worth it? Is one of these questions. And I think that, I guess what I'm going for in this poem that I'll read is kind of concerned with that. Do the ends ever justify the means? Does a paradise justify suffering of any kind? But let me read this and then we'll have a little chat. The poem, rather grandly, is called The Capital of Heaven. The capital of heaven is the living. I don't know what I mean by that yet, but it has less to do with the trace of gold each person contains. A thought is heavier, and more to do with a moment today under the great canopy of oak trees. In the park where it is always summer, a sister taught her brother to hold a segment of clementine up to the sun, so the light could find the seed with the future in it, which he could toss over his shoulder like salt at misfortune. So much of everything is beyond intention. So much of sacrifice is pleasure. If it must be inevitable, let there be lifetimes and lifetimes before orange trees grow wild here in the sun-scorched grounds. I don't mean it's paved with bones, but I do. I want to say it again to make it mean something different. The capital of heaven is the living. Let's have a chat. I may, I'd just like to ask a couple of small questions that we kind of touched on a little bit. And I think, Dane, you touched on this a little bit, so maybe I'll begin by asking you, Don, where would you say you encountered Seamus Heaney's work for the first time?
You know, it was probably just flick it on at the bottom for me.
Oh, yes, it is.
Right.
That's true. Yeah, it would have been, you know, in the 90s, whenever I was at school, you know, in Belfast High, and I think when I encountered Seamus Heaney at school, there was generally a sense of reverence, and that's kind of what you pick up when you get taught in that kind of early way. Similar with Philip Larkin, but I think it was really when I went to university and actually was encouraged in workshops, I think, to kind of take a poem like Personal Helicon and sort of think about what was going on there, the person behind it. What really came through, I think, when I started to really kind of look at the poet Seamus Heaney rather than the idea of Seamus Heaney, was just this kind of sense of someone who had immense kindness, and I think that's something that struck me first and foremost, and I think I've followed that thread through his poems in terms of the kind of energy that he brings to the poetic world. He sets that tone. Yeah, so it would have been during my undergrad years, I would fully engaged with him for the first time.
There's an interesting article on the BBC today, which was about, I guess, Heaney's enduring legacy and influence. And there was a couple of young people, teenagers, I think, who were asked about Heaney. And one of them said the thing that's probably difficult to say, which is, she said that when she was young, encountering him for the first time, that it was overanalyzed, that you sort of had difficulty with it. And I wonder, do you remember as a teenager, were you behind it to start with, or did you resist it in any way?
No, I definitely instantly forgot about poetry. I think as soon as I left school, it was very, very resistant to it. I think the way maybe English is taught at school is a wider subject as well, but it was yeah, there was a kind of something about just it was difficult. I find it difficult to understand. I think the humanity behind it. I think it's something that feels so important. I think now to understand it now as an adult.
Yeah, Dane, you mentioned during undergrad is when, I guess, most properly encountered Heaney. Is that right?
No, because I was lazy, a very lazy student who was more interested in like doing stuff other than the thing I should have been doing, mainly writing lyrics to what I thought were Lost Doors songs. But if Jim Morrison grew up in Sheffield. But yeah, I first sort of really got into the weeds of it. There was an edition just after Heaney had died of Poetry Island Review that had sort of 50-ish poems, and then a poet would write a very short essay about why this poem meant something to them. I think I sort of hitched my wagon to the young person who said it was potentially overanalyzed, because I always sort of hated that thing of going through and counting vowels. I've had to do that sometimes, and I've always sort of felt like I was cheating either the student or the reader of doing that. Heaney sort of Granta architecture and his movements from one thought to the next. Like, I think the St. Kevin the Blackbird is the ultimate in Heaney of that movement between phases of narrative and movement between rhythms and emotions, and two different sides of the same story is much more appealing than the rhymes Badger and Roger, which are fine, they're good rhymes, fine, but that doesn't mean as much to me as the overall picture. Did you get that feeling? I think the instinct of it.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're not here to worry about how things are taught, but I think it's interesting that's still a kind of response. And I know that when I was a young person encountering Heaney in secondary school, it was the early poems, which I hope you're not disappointed we didn't read any of this evening. I mean that That first book, Death of a Naturalist, 1966. So some of the very famous poems are in that book, and maybe you'll forgive us if you're glad that we sort of didn't share those ones. But I know as someone who had a kind of rural upbringing, there was something that I resisted in seeing those poems about blackberry picking, about working in the fields, about this sort of thing. I kind of felt that it was too close to my experience. It was kind of, I mean, it's a young person's problem, that it was too close to my experience where I couldn't see the skill in it. I couldn't see the brilliance of the technique. But it's certainly as an older person, you understand what you're looking at. You understand the kind of skills of it, and it seems often to be the case that as one gets older, you see things differently. I know in my case, I had an interesting conversation with Glen, the poet, and we both said with somewhat high a level of embarrassment, that, you know, being a younger person, someone like Philip Larkin, the marvelous English poet, seemed to be more attractive than he did, and part of that is a resistance to seeing what you feel as familiar, I think, and you know, that desire to move in a different kind of direction. I think I've probably changed my mind in some ways, but it's interesting that we both have that kind of instinct. But yeah, it's mysterious, the terms that we encounter. I wanted to ask too about influence to some extent. I mean, we've had 3 poems from each of us, as you know, that bear some relationship with Heaney's work. For me, I find it quite difficult to quantify what that influence would be, because he is so much the exemplar of what an Irish poem is, certainly, and to some extent what a modern poem in English is. I mean, is there anything you can see in your work that you could describe as an influence from Heaney? I know there are some lines gone in the lovely piece that you read, but how would you describe his influence on your work?
I think for me, the touchstones for me with anything I write is how the rhythm of it, I think, and the beats to a line. You know, when I was writing Week Later, I was very conscious of each line having, you know, 5 beats, and kind of writing in this, you know, so-called blank verse where you were sound very conversational. And with Heaney's just masterful with his rhythm and the way that he breaks it and the way that he lays out his page, and how he's used of sound and the soundscapes and the sounds within sounds, and not just straightforward rhyme, but really just how everything feels in your mouth when you say it. And it feels like another thing, again, to read a Heaney poem out loud than it is to read it off the page. And I think it was Heaney's poems originally that I would have read aloud to kind of get a sense of what rhythm could do and what that could carry. Especially more sort of narrative poems that kind of rely maybe a little bit more on a certain sense of rhythm for the pace of things. So yeah, I would say that. I'd say sound and his rhythm. It's hard to think of anyone who does it better.
How would you think? Can you describe it in any way, that influence, or what shape or form might it take?
There's, when you have to teach, I'm not really one of that teachers, but when you have to teach, or when you have to sort of like, I guess, read poetry for like a living, you have to read a lot of stuff, and a lot of it isn't great, and some of it's good, and then you sort of have to reset your mind into what a poem actually is and can do. And there are 2 people who I have to read to sort of press the refresh button in my eye and ear, which is Sylvia Plath and Seamus Heaney. And the Heaney for, you know, knowing the very basics of like which word should go in front of the other word, what a line is, what an image is. You know, there are images from, you know, countless Heaney poems that I have in my head forever because they're so perfectly drawn, so subtle, and they don't insist upon themselves, they're not overdone. Like Dawn said, knowing the subtleties of the English line sort of coming through, you know, probably through Larkin and through Yeats as well, and through Thomas Hardy, and how those can be suited to the contemporary moment. And also from sort of field work onwards, I like Seamus Heaney's personality, or the the personality of Seamus Heaney the poet, because he sort of he ends up sort of, after I think he sort of made a name for himself, he tries out all these little disguises. Like he can be like really bad, like a really bad person sometimes. Like there's a poem in Fieldwork which imagines him sort of committing adultery while his wife is watching, and it's really odd, really like. Well, the poem is really beautiful, and it's like I don't think he would have sort of tried that out earlier, but he manages to sort of create all these alter egos. There's a real like self-dramatizing potential in that sort of later or like that mid-period Heaney, which is really, really remarkable and brave and honest, I think.
Yes, the period that I find extremely interesting is that kind of middle bit, which is a great phrase that he uses in Stepping Stones, the book interviews that Glen mentioned, where he talks about trying to get a greater sense of allowing his social self into the poems, which I think is a really marvelous way of thinking about that personality, that it tends not to be these poems of history and landscape and procedure and the kind of big metaphors of the early work. And it's not necessarily the violence that he's trying to write about in the middle 1970s. What is it like to be him? What is it like to live the life that he is living, and to allow this conversational voice to come in, which I think is really, really compelling. I would say for myself that I mean, one of the most interesting and valuable things besides the work, because it's impossible really to describe its influence. I mean, you're all here because of it, and it's very, very difficult. You might agree to try and describe what that effect is on you. But one of the things that was an interesting thing to do among the many strange things we did during lockdown. I watched a lot of interviews that Seamus Heaney had given across his career, and one of the things that's really compelling about it is the kind of permission he gives people, or he gives writers, to do what they're doing seriously, and that's not really an easy thing to do. But to see him respond, on American, not exactly talk shows, but sort of late night think shows, I guess, to talk so seriously and so candidly and so openly and with humour about his life and his experience, and to speak sincerely about his art and to really believe that it is a worthwhile thing to be doing. That does not come easy, I think. I think it's oftentimes for younger people, ego blasts that out of the way, and you're pretending that you're doing it seriously, even when you're not. But that example of how to conduct yourself with language, how to write about the matters of our world, and how do you write about violence? Should you write about it? If you do, what should you know about? It seems beyond the work, although he himself is quite difficult to separate from the work, I'm sure. That's a marvelous example of how to conduct yourself as a writer and an artist, to do it sincerely and well and passionately and generously, and to leave this incredible wake that other people can kind of course on, which is marvelous. Time flies much faster than you think it does. Why don't we pause for a second? I would love to ask some of you in the audience if you have any questions or comments or remarks or anything of that nature that you might want to bring up. It's as Glen said, remarkable to think it's been 10 years. That's almost unimaginable, but it is so. So yes, I wonder if you have any comments, thoughts, questions, anything you would like to bring up.
I have this lovely microphone that I can bring to you. I was threatening earlier to share my memory of encountering Heaney's work for the first time, and the book that I first read was North, and I was a first year student at Glasgow, and although he wasn't the first poet whose work I loved, it certainly set me well on that road, and actually then brought me all the way to Belfast to study Irish poetry at Queen's. So I love the voice, and and just that kind of connectedness into the voice, but it certainly made me fall in love with poetry, and as I said, then I thought to myself there was so much to think about, and that brought me over here. So then I ended up working on Heaney for my PhD, so I didn't really let him go once I was on the road. You know, he stayed with me, so that was terrific. And I suppose it's great to be here today and in a library that Seamus Heaney loved and yeah, you know, thought so much about. So yeah, so there you are. My little, and actually, I suppose one of the kind of funny things for me was that when I was at Glasgow, Philip Holt was there. So I was studying Heaney and becoming interested more in Irish literature. And Philip Holt was at Glasgow, who had been over here at Queen's and who had been a great encourager of Heaney. So yeah, one way or another, it feels as if I was destined to, the fates were aligning and destined to come over here. But Heaney certainly, it felt as if Heaney's work had a hand in it. So,
God, they're all very quiet. They're all very somber.
Oh, good women.
Very much. It's just, I quite like Seamus Heaney's sense of humour. People who think he was a poet or perceived people support. Why is that?
It's a little bit sweet. I don't know why.
What do you think?
Do you think we might hear you just at least?
I think you might.
Yes. Thank you very much.
I liked Heaney's sense of humour. He was a very human poet. So many of them can be a little bit inhuman. I remember watching an interview that Heaney was doing with Melvyn Bragg. Melvyn Bragg was being terribly, terribly serious. And he picked out one of Heaney's poems. I can't remember which one it was. It was from The Naturalist. And Heaney, or Melvyn Bragg, went into this very long peroration about what the poem meant and the symbolism and the whole heap, and he went on for about 4 or 5 minutes, and at the end of it, Heaney sat back and said, well, I'm really glad you brought that out of it, but it really was just as it was written. You know, because sometimes, there's somebody mentioned up there about over-analysing, that just reminded me of Heaney very, very gently saying to Melvyn Bragg, well, really, honestly, catch yourself up.
I watched recently the Fables, and saw and he was doing that with Billy Connolly. Just in mentioning the humour. Sorry, please.
All of you are teachers of poetry. I just wonder how you experience the incoming generation of students, and whether you notice a significant change in their perception in response to Heaney.
I think to some extent it depends where those students are coming from. But I would say with some confidence that if they're coming from really the English-speaking world, they know his work to some degree, which is remarkable. I mean, we have students from the Caribbean, we have many Americans, Canadians, Australians, etc. But Heaney's work is extremely present in their upbringings, as far as I can tell. And of course, people from Ireland, we can take it for granted that it will come up. But I don't see any particular diminishment, I think, in the interest in Heaney and the knowledge of his work. Although I think the GCSE in the UK has changed recently to make some interesting choices about who's on that curriculum, and I think there's a move away from some people like that, which I think is a shame. But I do think that people interested in poetry know the work very well, is my experience. I mean, is that true of people in Dane teaches in various places, but in the Crescent is one of them? I mean, do people know Heaney's work there when you encounter them?
Yeah, you frequently get people coming to writing classes who say, well, they don't say, but you can tell from the work that, you know, want to write like Seamus Heaney. And I always say, which one? Sounds really fun. But because I think there's so many Heaneys, it's like 6 Seamus Heaneys that I know from reading the poems. But he's so various that he is a poet who you can have all sorts of different relationships with him, whether that's, you know, you sort of vibe more with the rural aspect, or if you're from America and you're, I don't know, Bill Clinton, then you can say one thing, and if you're from the Caribbean, then it will mean something else to you. Like Larkin is sort of, his horizons are very shallow. I think there's just like one Larkin. The man next door, I think Simon honestly says, wasn't the man who lived next door to me, but that's who was always sort of marketed as like, he was the guy in the street. He was very one figure, but Heaney was, through such a long career and such like an adventurous aspect. There are so many Heaneys, and I think that, and then the idea of having more than one Heaney is brought about ultimately by new readers. So I think you'll just keep developing. There'll be a whole clone army of Seamus Heaneys. Sorry, that's really cool. I don't know what I said. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I don't look at that. I got your slag and I'll look like it. I'm a bit shocked. I think you're right. I think exactly what Dane said. I think it's just that there's so many different types of Heaney, and more and more. I mean, for me, I've come through relatively recently the process, undergrad, masters, PhD, and what I see is Heaney as a template for adventure. You know, one of the things we did during our masters was to try to write 8 poems in the style of Seamus Heaney, you know, so you had to try to write something that sort of reflected what he was doing, and how everyone came to get to grips with that, what they saw as what Heaney was doing was so various and so different, whether it was humour, whether it was grief, whether it was, you know, absences, and you know, The Tall and the Man and St. Patrick and the Blackbird are such entirely different kinds of poems. So, you know, he's the perfect will-o'-the-wisp, you know, to kind of allow yourself to, you know, allow your sort of imagination to take off from. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Seamus Heaney's personality is quite a humble person. And I was just thinking, what would he make of kind of the industry now that is fills him up? Would he be comfortable with that, or would he shy away from that sort of the way he sort of tells the benchmark? I just think that if you build people up too much, you can miss other poets as well that were around at the same time.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I've seen a bit of that kind of, yeah, that sort of question as well, sort of arising in social media a little bit, you know, and is it, you know, I think we have that tendency, don't we, as a culture, to sort of feel if someone's built up, do we need to question that? And it's always good to question. I think the thing about Heaney and his persona and everything that he's left behind, you know, is really an invitation for people to come forward and be themselves, and to not be the, you know, the political, if you don't want to be, to try to find out who you are as a poet. And I think that kind of invite to find yourself can really be a positive thing. But I hear what you're saying about the kind of industry idea.
Because you can kind of get bombarded with him, you know, and I think he's a great poet, no doubt about it, but I think you can get so bombarded it actually dulls people, puts people off, especially young people, if they think that he's a sort of Leviathan. And if you're 16 and your mum's talking about James Heaney or whatever, it kind of puts you off a bit. So in some ways I think it's kind of a poison chalice to build some off that level, where I think, you know, but I guess as decades go by, then his legacy, you know, you get a perspective on his work or whatever. But I just think about building people up is never a good thing, personally speaking. That's just me.
Which I think is perfectly reasonable, but
I just wanted to say something. If you don't mind me speaking.
Oh God, that was very loud. If you don't mind, partly because I just know what time it is, and that we're coming towards the end here. And if you didn't mind me saying, I think one of the things with Heaney, and as you said about building up, is that started to happen in his lifetime. He won the Nobel Prize in 1995, and when I said how how generous it was that he lent his name to our Seamus Heaney Centre. I mean, I don't think that always was easy, the attention that came within his lifetime. And I think he was very aware of the fact that, as Dawn said, if you get built up, there's always going to be people who are going to be looking to knock you down. So I think he was always very aware of that. But I do think there was great humility in him as a poet, as an artist, and as a human being. So if I could just finish this, if you didn't mind, just drawing to a close this evening, a couple of things I wanted to say. As Dawn was reading the gravel walks and that line, walk on air against your better judgment, and thinking about the influence of Heaney, I don't know if any of you saw Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, the series, the pretty good series, that wasn't it? Brilliant series. It's by Walk on Air Productions. That name for that film company who made that terrific series. And just, I think it's on that level that Heaney has entered into our language and our imaginations and what those words did. And I think that's where we can still feel that influence, even if we don't recite the poetry, even if you don't know it, you'll have heard some of those lines. 10 years ago, when Seamus died, there was an event in the Lyric Theatre the night after he died, I think. And the next day, I was going off to Canada to do a writer in residence at St. Michael's University of Toronto. And they were having a similar event there, and there was this many people in the room, and there were about 10 people on the stage, all of whom were going to read and say something about their connection to Heaney. This is in Toronto, and I was thinking, how could you all have a connection to Seamus Heaney? And every single one of them read, and every single one of them had a story to tell about when they met Heaney, when they heard him read, when they were taught by him. And the last person to read said that he was at a conference, it was very late at night, and he was walking through the bar, and Seamus was sitting at the bar by himself. And this guy had never met Heaney before, and he walked over to him and he said, you can imagine this conference has been going on, Seamus has been working, it's at the end of the day, he's just probably looking forward to a quiet drink. And the guy said to him, what's a good Irishman doing sitting at a bar by himself? And he said, we're waiting for you, obviously. Which I think is a pretty good response, and they sat for a considerable time after that. I hope that, well, first of all, I just want to thank Stephen Sexton, Don Watson, and Dane Holt for their readings. For the connections that they were making between their own work and between Heaney's work, and to all of you again for coming out to Patsy Horton and to the Lynn Hall Library for hosting this evening. The last interview, I did an interview with Seamus in here in the boardroom, got the governor's room. I've forgotten the year, it was for Belfast Literary App. And the interview is probably still available online, but he read Tate Avenue. There was gorgeous poem, and I think if any of you take away anything from tonight, take away these great poets, the sound of Heaney running through, and if you want to go and pick up a book and read Tate's Avenue, I highly recommend that. Anyway, thank you to Stephen Sexton, Don Watson, and again, thank you all of you.